My name is Robert Cummings, and I am chair of the Department of Writing and Rhetoric. And I also chair, I suppose, of the Digital Media Studies Interdisciplinary Minor, who is the sponsor today of our speaker, Sue Gardner, and along with the ISOM Center for Gender Studies as well. I don't have a CV for Sue, so I'm going to tell you, I don't have the official CV sort of introduction for you, so I want to tell you a little bit about Sue and how I came to know her and what Sue is interested in, and a little bit about her path. She's very comfortable in this building because she started her career as a journalist, working for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and eventually helped them run their website before she then transitioned to the world of Wikipedia. So she became the executive director for the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the nonprofit which we sometimes say is the front office of Wikipedia, if there is such a thing. It has several other functions, though. It also is the keeper of the software that runs Wikipedia, as well as some other lesser-known Wikimedia open community projects. After doing that, Sue's transitioned to board work with several organizations. So I'm very pleased to serve with her on the board of the Wiki Education Foundation, which is an organization which promotes teaching with Wikipedia in higher education and has hundreds of classes, and we've got over 10,000 students, I think, cumulative just this past semester. Sue's also on the board of several other organizations, including the Tor Project, and then also some organizations that support privacy in the internet age. So Sue's talk tonight is how the internet broke democracy and what we can do about it now. And I'd ask you to join me in welcoming Sue Gardner.
Oh, I'm the worst because now I have to start with a small correction. This is the no, it's okay, but it's the danger when we don't do the CV rundown, which nobody ever wants. I'm not actually on the board of the Tor Project. I advise them and I help them, but I'm not on their board. I say that because this is being taped and will go on YouTube. Yeah, no problem. So I want to start just with a kind of an audio check. Can you hear me okay in the back? And the audio is fine, right? It's not echoey or anything? That's good because I mic'd myself, so I was worried that it might not be all right, but it is all right. Yeah? Okay, thank you. So I am Sue Gardner, and the talk that I'm going to do here is how the internet is breaking democracy and what we should do now. And it's funny because I was out for dinner with a couple of friends about 2 nights ago, and it turns out that one of my friends is writing a book on how the internet broke democracy, and another of my friends is giving a talk in Fredericton in New Brunswick in 2 weeks on how the internet broke democracy. So I now feel much more confident that I'm not clickbaiting you with my title. It's actually like a true thing. I did feel confident before, but now I feel better. And the reason that I've been thinking about this and talking about it is because, of course, it was a year and I think 2 days ago that we came to the end of a really problematic, really divisive, really difficult election campaign. I was personally, I'm Canadian, and so I was personally super shocked when Donald Trump won the presidency. It was a thing that I was surprised happened. I didn't expect it to happen. And so I feel like I've spent a whole year sort of post-processing how that came to pass. Maybe we all have, I don't know, in our different ways. But I spent a whole year kind of processing it and trying to figure out what happened. And I was particularly interested in to what extent the internet played a role in what happened. I've lived in Silicon Valley for 10 years now. I've worked in technology for 10 years. It seemed clear to me that there was a bunch of stuff happening on social media that felt new. I had not experienced it in previous election campaigns. And so I did a whole lot of research and digging into it and read a whole bunch of the academic work that's being done. And my conclusion is yes, that the internet is breaking democracy around the world, not just in this country. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. I have a couple of disclaimers and sort of warnings before we start. And the first is, This deck includes a bunch of what is now being called fake news or hyperpartisan news. I'm showing slides. And a lot of the imagery that was shared on social media during the election campaign, you probably saw some of it, so it's not necessarily the case that you're going to see things that you didn't see shared into your social media feeds, but I feel like I should just like say up front, some of it is inflammatory and some of it is offensive. A lot of it is also factually incorrect. So I want to give that disclaimer before I begin. And then two more quick disclaimers. One is, this is not intended to be a partisan talk. I have political opinions like everybody else, but the purpose of this talk is not for me to persuade you that my political opinions are the correct ones. So I'm going to try and keep any partisanship and personal opinions out of it. And the second disclaimer is, this talk is not about everything that happened during the election campaign. I'm really only going to focus narrowly on the internet and specifically mostly on social media. And so I made this slide to sort of act as a kind of a parking lot. So what this slide shows is a bunch of journalistic and political scientist explanations for why the election played out the way it did. I find them all interesting. I think some of them are more likely major contributors than others. You might feel the same about some of these and differently about others. But the only reason really it's up here is because I would hate for one of you to be sitting in your chair thinking, but James Comey, right? When is she going to mention James Comey? So I'm not going to mention any of these things. I think Russia might be on the slide. I am going to talk a little bit about Russia. But mostly this is parking lot stuff. So I wanted to start by kind of stepping back and reminding us of the early days of the internet and what we thought it was going to be like. And when I speak about the early days, I'm imagining sort of 1990 onwards and up to maybe the middle of the 2000s, maybe as late as 2007 or even as late as 2010. The people in the early days of the internet who were building it and practitioners and making websites, and so for example, the people at Wikipedia, right? We all believed that the internet was going to have a massive leveling effect on democracy. It was going to have a democratizing influence on the world. In the world to date, right, there have been a lot of people excluded from having a voice, right? The mass media has done as good of a job as it can of laying out what the sort of major issues are and helping people to understand the world around them. But the mass media has also been inherently limited in a bunch of ways, right? And so when the internet first came along, people like me, I confess, people like me thought that it was going to be a massive force for good in the world. We thought it was going to make the world a dramatically better place. And so it's in that context, I think, that we embarked on this experiment and built sites like Wikipedia was in a spirit of hope and a spirit of optimism. But I think that even in that world, even as that was playing out, there were three trends that I would identify now that I would see as precursors to what we saw during the election campaign. Some of them were obvious at the time, and some of them only became clear, I think, more so in retrospect than they were at the time. But I'm going to talk you through those three trends before we get into the campaign itself. And the first is that we know famously, the internet accidentally broke the news industry, right? And so how that happened was, for much of the 20th century, it was fairly straightforward to have a profitable news business, right? Ordinary people, we never paid the full costs of news production and news dissemination. And we didn't have to, and the reason we didn't have to was because advertisers did heavy subsidizing of the news industry, right? And so what that meant was advertisers were in fact paying for our foreign bureaus and our investigative newsrooms and a lot of the copy editing and the researching. It was subsidized by the fact that advertisers were buying advertisements in newspapers and in broadcast television. The internet didn't do it on purpose, and they shouldn't be blamed for it, but the internet accidentally broke that model. That started with Craigslist. Do you guys use Craigslist? Yeah. So Craig Newmark founded Craigslist in 1995, and it immediately became the place where most people put most classified advertising. Classified advertising had actually been a pretty big revenue stream for newspapers specifically, and it immediately just went away. But it really came to fruition, and the news industry's business model really started to break when advertising started to move from broadcast television and newspapers onto the internet, because on the internet, advertisers had lots of other ways to spend their money, including on their own websites and their own social media presences. And so what ended up happening was the money moved to the internet. The statistics are different depending on whose data you look at. This, I think, is from the Wall Street Journal. But it looks like what happened was about 80 cents, almost 80 cents of every dollar spent on advertising ended up being spent at Google and at Facebook, who were new intermediaries. And so the money that used to go directly into the news industry suddenly was getting captured somewhere else. And that resulted in this. Have you guys seen this slide ever? So if you work in news, right, we call this the holy shit slide. Because what it shows is beginning in 1950, right, newspapers get richer and better off, and they're turning a profit, and everything is fine, and everything is fine, and everything is fine, and then it just falls off a cliff, right? So the revenues fall off a cliff. This slide gets showed at like every Future of News conference I think that I've ever attended. This one only goes to 2010. If you push it into the future, the numbers continue to decline. I've seen versions of this slide where you add on the digital revenue that news organizations are making for their online presence, and it doesn't really change the number at all, right? It's still falling off a cliff. They call it digital dimes that used to be, I think, traditional dollars, right? So they're making pennies on the dollar of what they used to make. And as a result of the decline in revenue that the news industry broadly has seen, today, we have roughly half the number of working journalists in the United States that we had 20 or 30 years ago. The same is true in Canada. The same is true throughout much of Europe. And so you have far fewer working journalists. And at the same time, we have far more people working in PR. There used to be a one-to-one relationship in the United States between journalists and PR people. And now it's a 6-to-1 relationship. So the balance is very different from what it used to be. So that's precursor number one. Precursor number two, and I wish I had a more elegant way to phrase this, but the internet has grown into and has become a kind of massive machinery for micro-targeting people and persuading them of things, right? For a long time, the internet didn't have a business model. In Silicon Valley, we used to call it venture capital story time, right? Because the idea was you persuaded rich venture capitalists that your idea was interesting and they would give you money, but that was not really a business model, that was just how things worked. But over time, it did develop a business model, and for some entertainment properties, it's user pay through subscriptions, but for the vast majority of online content, it's advertising. But it is advertising that is very different from what we used to have, right? So in the old advertising world, you know, you were an advertiser, you want to reach some people, you could choose popular television programs, you could choose magazines, or you could choose newspapers. And your ability to target those people was really, really limited, right? So you could target American families or people living in a particular town, or you could target people who were interested in football, right? But your ability to get really granular was extremely limited. And that has changed. This is a graphic that shows the industry that's called ad tech, right? And there is a blog that updates this every year. This is the most current version, which is from May. And it shows the 5,000 companies that make up the ad tech industry, which is what I am calling the machinery of targeting and persuasion. And it works essentially like this. I'm going to give you like a very kind of overly simplified version of how this works. So I am a person, and I use Facebook like most people. And so when I decide to go, so let's not make it me, let's say Ingrid. Ingrid decides to join Facebook. And what she does is she voluntarily fills out the form, right? And she gives up to Facebook, as we all have done, you know, the city that she lives in, the year she was born, her gender, is she or is she not a college graduate? She discloses some information on purpose. But as Ingrid wanders around the internet, she's also giving up all kinds of other information just through her interactions online, through the liking that she does, through the commenting, the tweeting, all the various interactions, things that she buys, right? She's wandering around the internet, sort of throwing off all this data, all this information about her. And then what happens is Facebook collects that, right? They build a profile of her. So that is my user profile number on Facebook. And Facebook has typically thousands of data points about each person who uses the platform. I stopped using Facebook a couple of months ago. They still have a user profile of me, right? Like I can control the publicly available data about me, and I can control whether the stuff that I made continues to exist in a form that I can see. But Facebook still has its own cache of data, which it is not obligated to show me or to delete because I ask them to. So if I'm an advertiser, has anybody here ever created an ad on Facebook? Okay, so I did it for the first time the other day. I had never done it before. So I went, and you just go onto the main page, bottom left, it says create ad. Anybody can do it, which is another new thing, right? It didn't used to be the case that anybody could make an advertisement and target other people, but now we can. And so if I want to create an ad, which I did the other day, I can target people who live in San Francisco, who are between adult women, who are expats from Canada, like myself, who are college graduates, and I can actually target who are interested in Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, right? So that is like extremely precise. And it will give me this result. I can reach 1,500 people who fit that profile. And then what I can do is I can send them an advertisement. It will cost me $30 or $100, right? And I can micro-target these people according to their political beliefs, according to demographic data, according to attitudinal stuff, all kinds of things. This was never possible before, right? Like this is brand new. This was not possible to do. So that's another thing we know going into the 2016 election campaign. And then the third precursor is the acceleration of hyperpartisanship that has come to pass as a result of social media. And I think it's important to note that partisanship has always been with us, right? And we have become increasingly hyperpartisan or polarized as a society, America, also Canada, over the last, 30, 40 years, right? What we've seen is we are increasingly sorting ourselves into communities of people who are similar to each other, right? So typically now, this didn't used to be the case, right? We used to be kind of mixed up. And now we are increasingly living in neighborhoods with people who look like us, right? We are interacting mostly with people who share our political views, right? Who have the same kinds of values that we have. So we've been doing that for a while, right? And that's been known by social scientists, and books have been written about it and so forth. That's what you see on this chart, right? Is the growing sort of polarization and pinning against the walls of people. But it looks like the internet is increasing and accelerating that. Have you guys seen this story at all? Do you know this story? It was from a site called Addicting Info. This was an extremely popular story. Something like 11 million people, I think, saw this story. And so I'm going to explain it because it actually speaks directly to the hyperpartisanship issue. So 10 years ago, people were experimenting with how they were going to make money on the internet, right? At that time, news sites were kind of scared and anxious and kind of tweaking their products a little bit so that people would click on it, and they were getting maybe a little bit accused of starting to make clickbait and stuff like that. But at the same time, there was a group, or there was a sort of a group of entrepreneurs and people who were looking at the internet as a blank slate and saying, how could we make money from this thing? And what they decided to do was sort of reinvent news and information from first principles, right? What is it that people want to see? What will they click on? What will they be interested in? And that's when we first started to see clickbait. And so clickbait was like superficial. It was kind of like catchy. It was interesting. It was sort of grabby, but it wasn't very substantive, right? And that's what led to stories like this one, right? I let a pit bull near my baby. Here's what happened next. Upworthy used to do a lot of those titles, right? Like what happened next will alarm you, you know? And so the idea was to get people interested, get them to click on it, and then they would see your advertisements and you would make some money. And this actually worked. These organizations were profitable. And the reason they were profitable was because the cost of creating this kind of content is really super low, right? They don't have researchers. They don't have an investigative unit. They don't have a foreign bureau. They don't necessarily have a big editing staff. So the costs of production are super low. And it's optimized to be socially shared, which means it's going to be seen by more people, which means it's going to be profitable. it turned out that as folks started using data analytics to figure out what people were clicking on and to make more of it for them, we started to get really smart about what pushed people to share news on social media. And it turned out the biggest driver of sharing on social media was emotion, right? And the emotion that most predictably encouraged people to share turned out to be anger. And the most reliable way to produce anger was through writing about politics, right? And so that simple sort of logic was how we got hyperpartisan news. So hyperpartisan news typically is not made by people who have a political agenda. They aren't necessarily themselves ideologically invested in it. They're simply looking for a profitable business model so they can have a company that makes money, and hyperpartisan news is the most predictable way to do that. And so what we saw, starting in about, I think, 2013, 2014, we started seeing this kind of hyperpartisan news pop up, right? And so you can see there was something like 187 domain registrations in 2016 alone. We started seeing this leap in this kind of news. And that changed the overall news ecosystem. So this is an image of, I think it's Twitter shares of media. And the blue is considered left-wing, and the red is considered right-wing. I would argue, and I want to caveat this with I am Canadian, so my political values are probably like a little bit different from most Americans. But I would argue that a lot of the stuff that is characterized here as left-wing, like NBC News or the Huffington Post, CNN, is actually pretty mainstream, I think, right? The stuff that you're seeing that's characterized as right-wing on the right-hand side of the slide, like Breitbart or Truthfeed or Angry Patriot, I think is one of them, Gateway Pundit, Fox News, Daily Caller. That strikes me, some of that stuff is verging on being hyper-partisan, right? Like it's not in the center, the comfortable center where we all agree on basic facts. It's shading into being stuff that is false, right? Or not necessarily always credible. So this is the world that the news media started to kind of sort itself into as we went into the 2016 campaign. So to recap, we're going into the 2016 campaign, and our situation is we have a weak and confused news industry that is like hemorrhaging dollars and losing staff and is anxious and concerned about its future. We have this new ability to micro-target people that we have never had before. And we have a huge upswing in hyperpartisan news. So that's us heading into the campaign. So then what happened? What happened is this. So I don't know if you can see that from where you're sitting. It's just a big collage. I'm worried that you can't see anything, Bob. You should possibly move over here. Can you see? Because I'm blocking you. Okay. Okay. So this is a bunch of the kind of thing. And I want to ask you guys, like, did you see this stuff in your social media feeds during the campaign, this kind of thing? Yeah, like a lot of it. Yeah, yeah. I made a fake Facebook profile during the campaign where I pretended that I was a young woman in Alabama, and I joined Alabama for Trump to see what would turn up in my feed, and I got tons of this stuff. I didn't like any of it. I didn't ask for it, but it was just turning up in my feed. So I think it's actually hard to make an argument that people were even choosing this, right? Like I think it was just present for some people and then completely invisible for other people. So I'm going to walk you through some of what this was and where it came from. So this is a dense slide, and I apologize, but I was trying to kind of pack a lot into this. But if you look in the bottom left here, so that's the hyperpartisan news sites, right, that I just described, that BuzzFeed describes as ideologues, opportunists, growth hackers, and internet marketers, right? And they're publishing stuff that is jokes or it's hoaxes. Sometimes it's conspiracy theories. Sometimes it's just advocacy. Sometimes it's sort of propaganda seeming. That material tended to be conservative, so it was right-wing stuff. 72% of it was conservative and only 28% of it was liberal. Again, that's not a result of the people making it being ideological. It's a result of what the market seemed to respond to, right? So when they made right-wing material, it got way more clicks. When they made left-wing material, it got less. Because they were profit-seeking, they made more of what seemed to have receptivity, right? What people seemed to want. And then in the top left, and this is a bit of a derail. But the top left, I don't know if you've been following the Senate investigation hearings into the Russian Internet Research Agency. Are you guys familiar with the Internet Research Agency? Yeah. So it's what they call in Russia a troll farm. And what that means is that it is funded in subtle, complicated ways, apparently, originally by the Russian government. And its work on the internet is to advance the kind of propaganda interests of the Russian government. And how they do that is they hire teams of young people, usually in their 20s, who take on various personas on the internet. And so what they do is they go into work in the morning and they work a 12-hour shift. And what they do in that shift is they operate a bunch of Twitter accounts, they operate a bunch of Facebook accounts, they make a lot of comments on news stories on like the Washington Post or CNN site or whatever. They write blog posts and things like that. And their purpose in doing that is to advance the agenda of the Russian government. And that sounds like it should be a thing that is kind of straightforward and clear, and they have talking points and they're executing some kind of communications agenda. But frequently what it looks like in practice is just spreading a kind of miasma of confusion and noise and sort of stirring up conversations in various ways, often seemingly with the intent to persuade people that politics is too toxic or too unpleasant or it's no fun to be involved in. So a lot of what they're actually doing in practice, it's hard to read intent really clearly into what they do, but some of what it appears to be in practice is an attempt to just demotivate people and make them feel bad about democracy, and then maybe they don't vote at all. Russia Today is often, their talking points are often repeated by the Internet Research Agency and the people who work for it. And of course, during the campaign, WikiLeaks was pretty active, publishing John Podesta's emails and stuff like that. And all of that got repeated and amplified through these hyperpartisan sites and through the Internet Research Agency's work. And so all of this went into Facebook, it went into YouTube, into Instagram and Twitter. And it was pretty present during the campaign. We know now from the Senate hearings that the Internet Research Agency bought advertisements on Facebook, right? It ran, or there were run by Russian people, something like 2,000 Twitter accounts. There were lots of bot networks that were, amplifying various messages and stuff like that. So there was a lot of activity during the campaign, and this material was seen by a lot of people. By the end of the election campaign, the sort of hyper-partisan and fake stuff was outperforming on Facebook and Twitter, outperforming more conventional news sources like CNN or the New York Times. Okay, so I'm going to show you some of the kinds of stuff that people saw. You probably saw some of this. So this is just opinion, right? Like there was one category of stuff that was just ordinary political opinions. And then there was a category of stuff that was false. Did you see this story? This was the most popular story on Facebook during the 2016 election campaign. And there were lots of variants of this story. There was a variant that was the Pope endorsed Bernie Sanders early in the Democratic Party primary. There was a post that he had endorsed Hillary Clinton, and then there was this post, which was the most popular one, that was that he had endorsed Donald Trump. It was not true, but it was super, super popular during the campaign. And then some of it was both completely false and also highly, highly inflammatory, right? And this was something that I saw this, it came across one of my feeds, and I couldn't imagine the person who saw this and thought it was true, but maybe those people exist, right? But there was a lot of this kind of thing as well. And then Pizzagate, which you guys surely heard about, right? And Pizzagate was false and inflammatory and a ludicrous conspiracy theory that, again, it's hard for me to imagine that people actually believed. You know the story, right? That there was a secret network of child sexual traffickers and of pedophiles operating out of the basement of a DC pizza parlor, which somehow John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, and his brother and a couple other people were actively involved in. And it's incredibly difficult for me to imagine that anybody was reading about this and taking it in any way seriously, but people did. I mean, there was a man who turned up at that pizza parlor with a gun. It was obviously a false story. There wasn't even a basement, I was told the other day, in that pizza parlor. So like that's like the least objectionable sort of manufactured piece of the lie. But it just bore zero scrutiny, but still a lot of people believed it. The Trump campaign actively put out a bunch of advertising during the campaign now in what is known as secret Facebook ads, which mean they're advertisements. They don't show up on the general internet or on Facebook generally. They show up only inside the feeds of people who have been micro-targeted with them. And those ads had various goals, which kind of netted out to, again, trying to dissuade people from voting. And so this advertisement was aimed at Bernie Sanders supporters, and its intent was to make them feel sick and annoyed and upset and ripped off so that they wouldn't vote. And then similarly, there was a whole sort of train of Trump advertising directed at young, presumably liberal women. And the goal of it was to make them feel that Hillary Clinton wasn't a feminist, wasn't a friend to women, wasn't a good advocate for women. Their goal, again, it was not to get those young women to vote for Donald Trump because that was unlikely to happen, but it was to make them just feel, you know, meh enough about the whole thing that they wouldn't vote at all. And there were a big chunk of the Trump advertisements were aimed at black people, right? And their intent there was the same. It was to remind black people of things that Hillary had said when Bill Clinton was rolling out I think it was called the crime bill or the anti-crime bill in 1994. And so the intent was to say, we know you came out and voted for Barack Obama. We know that you will not vote for Donald Trump. We would really like it if you just sat out this election and felt kind of alienated and despairing and like it wasn't worth your time. The Russians also bought a bunch of advertising during the campaign on Facebook. And this is some of what they did. And so here, and again, it's hard to read direct intent into what was done by the Internet Research Agency, right? This, presumably, the goal of this was to amplify Bernie Sanders, presumably to sort of peel away some support from Hillary Clinton. And then this advertisement was for a petition to have Hillary Clinton removed from the ballot. The idea being that dynastic succession of the Clinton family breaches the core democratic principles of the United States. And then this was targeting Christians on Facebook. And the goal here was it says Hillary is Satan, and Donald Trump is not a saint, but he is at least an honest man and he cares deeply about this country. And so the goal was to get people who self-identified as Christians to either vote for Donald Trump or at least to not vote for Hillary Clinton. So this is bonkers. It is. And so one of the questions that I asked myself, and I found myself especially asking this question I think it was last week or the previous week when I was watching the Senate investigatory hearings, right, was, is this legal? Like what exactly are we objecting to? What has gone wrong here? Because I think everybody has a slightly different understanding of what we think is bad about this. And I think it's important that we kind of agree on what we think is bad so we can figure out what to fix. So I've been talking with people at Facebook, and Facebook seems to understand this problem as people shouldn't pretend to be people who they are not on the internet, right? And so in Facebook's view, it seems like if the Russians had self-identified who they were, like we are Russian people, you know, posting about the election, that might have been okay. I don't actually think that is okay. So I was trying to figure out what of this bunch of stuff that happened, what do we agree is bad? And the truth is that we don't agree on very much, right? So legally, in the United States, you know, is it illegal to make misinformation that is accidentally false or disinformation that is deliberately false? Is it illegal to make that kind of stuff for money? So is it illegal to run something like a hyperpartisan news site? And the answer to that is no, it is not illegal. There are things that you can do that are illegal, like defaming somebody would be illegal, but publishing false information for money is fine. Is it illegal to share or amplify that kind of information using a bot network or paying people to spread the information for you as the Internet Research Agency did? No, that's perfectly fine in the United States. That is also not illegal. it is illegal to share disinformation deliberately to trick people into not voting. So it's okay to try to, for example, tell young women that Hillary is terrible and they shouldn't vote for her because she's not a feminist. It is not okay to like publish false hours about the polls, right? So it's not okay, as was done during the campaign. There were a bunch of advertisements, I don't know who bought them, but there were a bunch of advertisements that said, text to this number and you will have voted, right? That obviously was not true. You can't vote by text. And if the people who had made that ad had been caught, they could be punished for that. So that is actually not okay legally. But it's fine to run bots on Twitter. The whole micro-targeting, the secret posts, the sort of invisible Facebook posts, completely fine, not illegal at all. The one piece that the Senate is investigating that is illegal is if you are a foreigner, there's a limit to how active you're allowed to be in the American election campaign. I know that because technically I am not supposed to contribute to American candidates. Like, that's not okay. So it's not okay for the Russians to buy advertisements targeting Americans with the goal of interfering in the US election. But my point with this slide is that a lot of what happened under the current laws of the United States is not illegal, right? Maybe it should be, but it is not. So the last piece that I want to talk about during the election campaign is, like, through all this, what were the ordinary mainstream conventional news media doing, right? And the reality is that the normal conventional news media, like, really were doing a really bad job, right? So this is a Gallup daily tracking poll. Gallup ran this poll throughout the entire election campaign. And what they asked people was, what do you remember reading, seeing, or hearing in the media over the last day or two, right, about each of the presidential candidates? And so if you look at the Donald Trump, he's in red. You see that it's relatively substantive, right? He gives a speech, he talks about Mexico, he talks about immigration, I think he talks about the wall a couple times, he talks about families and plans, he makes statements. And that is roughly the kind of array that I think you would expect to see about a presidential candidate, right? Some substance, some sort of process stuff. But when you look at Hillary Clinton in blue, I mean, I'm sure it's no surprise to anybody in this room that the dominant word is email, right? Because the New York Times especially, but really all of the news media, CNN. I went to visit my father once during the election campaign, and because he is older, he has CNN on all the time, 24/7, extremely loudly in the house. And it was just email, 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 email. It was like relentless. It was extraordinary, right? And that was right after the November, oh, I can't remember when it was, but the Comey letter, right? It was right after that. And it was just wall to wall. And so lots and lots of email. Lie makes an appearance. Scandal makes an appearance. The Clinton Foundation and pneumonia makes an appearance as well. Bernie Sanders and liar and sick. And so, you know, if the job of the news media, which it is, the job of the news media is to help people be as informed as they possibly can be so they can make good decisions, maybe most especially during election campaigns, right? This shows us people did not come away equipped to do that, right? Like the news media, we just did not do a good enough job of putting people in a position where they understood the substance of the choice that was available to them, right? We just did not do that. And then here's a different view. This is different data, but it makes the same point. Berkman Klein Center did an analysis of a bunch of the media coverage of the campaign, and what they found was this is scandal-based coverage. Again, Hillary Clinton is blue, Donald Trump is red, and so tons of scandal-based coverage of Hillary Clinton, much less scandal-based coverage of Donald Trump. And this is issue substantive coverage, and it's the opposite. So twice as much substantive coverage of the agenda of Donald Trump, and then half as much substantive coverage of the agenda of Hillary Clinton. Right? So this was like a disservice to the American people, in my opinion. And so the question that I asked myself, and the question I think we all need to ask ourselves, like, again, very little of this was illegal, very little of this is even officially frowned upon. The kind of investigation that the Senate is doing is extremely narrow, right? The country, I think, is still really vulnerable, right? Nothing has changed. we kind of spent the entire 2016 campaign awash in misinformation and disinformation and outright propaganda designed to inflame us and make us upset and make us feel angry and make us feel alienated from the political process. There was very little in this election campaign that was healthy, I think, for democracy. And so we need to be grappling now, I think, with how do we fix that so we do a better job next time. I wish that there was a magic bullet that I could even just say, here's the magic bullet, someone should go and do X. It doesn't work that way. I wish it did. But what I do have is a couple notions from my experience kind of at the intersection of news and technology, and what it looks like to me needs to start happening. And the first thing is people need to start paying for news. We never paid the full cost of news. We never did. And so we're not used to it, right? But we really do need to start paying for news. User pay is a model that lines up the incentives, right? So that the journalists are working for ordinary people. Advertising was a perfectly okay model as long as it worked. But I think now we need to live in an environment where we're paying the full freight, right? And so what that looks like is, like, I have always felt it's been a little bit of a instinctive kind of game. Like, I read the New York Times and I read the Washington Post, and I'm happily skating around the paywall. I have not paid, right? And so I've been, like opening a new browser when I run out of my 10 free storage. I know it's terrible, right? Like, here I am saying pay for news. It's terrible. And I am going to bite the bullet and start paying, because it is fun to circumvent their paywall, and they make it into a fun game for me, but it is bad, right? Like, I need to start paying for the cost of news. So one is pay for news. And then counterintuitively in the United States, because public broadcasting has a very different position in the United States than it has in the rest of the world, your public broadcaster is the least well-funded in the entire world, with the exception of New Zealand. But everywhere else, they fund their public broadcaster at higher levels than you do. A public broadcaster is actually a really key institution in supporting a strong and healthy democracy. There is a ton of social science research. And what it says is, it's not only that countries with strong public broadcasters, their citizens are better informed, they understand more about the world, they're just better informed. But it's not just that. It's also countries that have a strong public broadcaster have a smaller knowledge gap between their sort of elites and their disadvantaged groups in their society. And that's because, in part, public broadcasters raise the game for everyone, because journalists like to compete and they like to win. And so if you have a strong publicly funded broadcaster, that gives everybody else something to compete against, and they want to beat them. And so it raises the bar for everybody. But the other thing that it does is, public broadcasters have a mandate to serve everybody. They don't just serve the market, right? So they don't just go where the money is. They're required to be, accessible to people with disabilities, and available to people in minority languages, and available to people in geographies where there simply aren't enough people to support a competitive media environment, right? So public broadcasters have all kinds of good effects on democracy. And even if you don't personally use it, the societal effects still exist, right? So I would really strongly argue support public broadcasting, like whether that means you think the government should give it more money, or here you donate to it yourself. It's like a societally beneficial thing to do, even if you personally aren't that interested in it. Encourage media literacy. And media literacy is like a thing that we talk about a lot. We talk a lot especially about teaching media literacy to young people. I actually think that at this point in our history, there's an argument for teaching media literacy to everybody, and maybe especially people who are older, right? I have seen my own parents. They are used to, and they grew up in a world where they could trust the media, right? Like, mostly, right? And if the media flat out lied or fabricated something, that was a scandal. And they have carried over those habits and that sort of credulousness, they have carried that over into the internet era, right? So my parents are, to me, remarkably unskeptical about stuff they see on the internet, because they tend to believe that it's been vetted or it wouldn't exist. And it's hard for me to explain to them that in this world, right, I could make it with Photoshop or MS Paint and put it up there, and there is no gatekeeper anymore, and they don't realize that, right? So I think media literacy right now is useful for everybody, not just for young people. Oh, and this one's so uncomfortable. And I almost took this slide out because it's so uncomfortable. It really is. Like, I don't feel great about saying this, but it is true that what the social science research is showing, there's a great organization in New York called Data in Society. And what Data in Society, they focus on younger people, so teenagers and people in their 20s and their use of social media, and they are super smart and they are super interesting. And what they found in their sort of postmortems of the 2016 election campaign was that a big part of the fuel for the sort of outrage machinery on social media is young men, and specifically young white men. And I don't know how familiar folks are here with Gamergate. Are you familiar with Gamergate? Right? And I hate talking about Gamergate because it's just such a horrible story, and it's just so unpleasant, and it's so disputed. And so I refer you to the Wikipedia article on Gamergate if you're interested, because it's actually very good, and it took a lot of people a lot of time to build that article. But what Gamergate was about, and here I cringe, right? But what Gamergate was about was the sustained targeting and harassment of a bunch of women for expressing opinions about what the culture of gaming is like and should be like, right? And there is now research tracing back a lot of the trolling and harassment and sort of online unpleasantness of the 2016 campaign to some of the folks who were initially involved in Gamergate, right? What Data in Society says is that young men, or some young men, are vulnerable to being used as amplifiers of messages that they find politically incorrect, right? Because they feel that they're being overly constrained and sort of forced into a box of saying only certain kinds of things and not other kinds of things. And they also have a lot of facility on the internet, right? Like, they're hanging out on the internet, they know how to make memes, like they know how to communicate in shorthand in ways that are understandable online. So they have a facility, they have a skill, right? And they also are vulnerable to people who target them to try to recruit them to far-right or alt-right sort of activities, right? And so I say this with a lot of hesitation. It's very uncomfortable. It's awkward to talk about. But it suggests, right, that if you have young men in your life who spend a lot of time on the internet, it's worth kind of keeping in touch with them and keeping an eye on them and not letting them become captive to folks who you don't want them to be captive to, and they probably really don't either. I say uncomfortably. Also, take social media breaks. This sounds like a small self-helpy kind of thing, but it's actually super true. I spend 16 hours a day on Twitter, so I'm the pot calling the kettle black, right? I'm very, very bad at taking social media breaks. But again, the social science research tells us use of social media or overuse of social media leaves us feeling really bad. It's actually not healthy for us, right? We come away from our use of social media feeling like we've wasted our time, right? We feel alienated from other people. Folks are very performative on social media, right? And so they're presenting the sort of most curated, awesome version of themselves. We compare ourselves to that and we feel kind of crappy about ourselves. That's very natural. We never talk about any of this. We all feel it secretly alone. The research says we are not alone. It's healthy to take breaks from social media because overusing it it's like just not good for us, right? We don't even know yet what it's gonna ultimately do to us, but the early indicators are not positive. I always argue that people should take steps to preserve their online privacy. So I use the Tor browser. I use Signal, which is an end-to-end encrypted messaging app. That is quixotic, right? Because the truth is we have very little privacy. And I think we often don't really understand that relative to 20 years ago, our lives are an open book, right? Google has, I looked it up the other day, I can go into Google's sort of repository of information about me, and I can look up where I was on like November 24th of 2007, right? I was in Aspen, Colorado, downtown at the intersection of X Street and Y Street. Google retains that information. I can't remember where I was, but I can look it up. Google has my entire search history going back to, I think, 2002. That is like a tour of the interior of my brain, right? I can go back and see what I was searching for at 2 in the morning, on whatever day. It is like a journey through the interior of my mind. I have forgotten all that stuff, but Google remembers it, right? So I think we really haven't come to terms with the fact that there's like an external hard drive of our brain out there that we don't control and can't delete. And so it is a little bit quixotic to say in that context, use an encrypted messaging app. It doesn't really change the landscape, right? But I think it's good to remind us a little bit that our data is ours, even if in practice it is not, that it belongs to us morally, I think is a good principle for us to kind of keep in the front of our minds. And then this is my last point, and then I think I go to questions. But I like to say this to Americans because Americans seem to me to be more suspicious of your government than most other countries, right? Or most other, European, North American countries. In Canada, we look almost hilariously, we look to our government for solutions, right? We're very willing to let the government come in and play a big role. When I moved to the Bay Area 10 years ago, I was astonished at how everybody I spoke with seemed to take it as a given that the government could never play a positive regulatory role related to the internet, right? And everybody I knew thought that that was the most hilarious idea, right? And so for years and years and years, we all said that, ha ha, the politicians don't understand the internet, right? We could never let them have any say over anything. And I think that was a message that was actively promulgated by Silicon Valley because folks did not want to be regulated, right? And so they argued for how they could self-regulate and they could, do a good job in the absence of being constrained by the state. And then I look at today and I think, well, how did that play out for us, right? Like that has not played out for us well. And we still see at the Senate hearings the other week, the lawyers from Twitter and Facebook and Google were making their case for how, they will voluntarily disclose various things. They're happy to disclose some things and not other things. They're still trying to avoid regulation, right? And so I feel like, if you look at where there are better protections for internet users, the best protections right now are in the European Union, right? They do have protections for individual privacy. In Germany, they have long-standing laws regulating hate speech and what is allowable to say. So Twitter, for example, will not show you Nazi people saying Nazi stuff in Germany because Germany won't let them, right? So Twitter has the ability to sort of screen really objectionable, beyond the pale stuff from public view, and they are doing it in Germany. They're not doing it in the United States because the United States hasn't asked them, isn't requiring them to do it. In Canada, we have hate laws, but we are not enforcing them on the internet yet, right? But I think that if you talk to folks at Google or Facebook or Twitter, the countries that they look to when they think about consumer protections, they look to the EU. If they feel like what the EU is doing is reasonable, they sometimes then roll it out for the rest of the world on the expectation that eventually they might be forced to, so they might as well do it now. And so I guess what I'm urging here is I'm urging consideration of the fact that a complete and total lack of regulation is not actually working out well, right? And so it might be time to be open to the idea that sometimes tempered regulation, even if it's not perfect, right, can actually be more beneficial than the opposite. That's it. I'm done. So I'll take questions.
We don't have a microphone to pass around, so what I'd ask you to do is ask the question, and then Sue, if you wouldn't mind the burdensome thing of repeating the question so that it's recorded.
Yeah, no problem.
So questions, please.
Yes.
So I'm curious about your point about young men maybe being more susceptible to sort of amplifying these kinds of messages than young women. And I'm curious, does the research say anything about why that might be? Is it maybe something about the way that sort of women express themselves on the internet, or is there something else that you've read about?
I think I'm speculating, right? So this is not based on the research, but like my speculation would be that other people who are not young white men are more likely to have experienced various harms, right? And so we know, for example, that women face a lot of harassment on the internet that men don't face, right? And so it seems sort of logical to me then that women would be, for example, women would be less likely to engage in kind of like the trolling, kind of lulzy kind of behavior, like the sort of 4chan stuff, or even some of the Reddit stuff, right? Because it isn't abstract for them, right? Like they have seen and they do see and they have experienced themselves the harms of some of that stuff, and so maybe the world in general maybe is a little bit less of a joke, right? But the organization, in fact, I have a slide. This is a link to a bunch of resources in case folks are interested in some of the stuff that I said. This is the link to like academic papers and blah, blah, blah. And the Data and Society paper is in that link, and it's huge, and they did a lot of qualitative research. So you might want to take a look at that. Yeah.
You said you quit using Facebook. I know it's a broad question, but what?
Of what?
Why did you quit using?
Oh, why did I quit using Facebook? Yeah.
I know you just went through a whole process of why, but you know.
Yeah, and partly, I mean, to be honest, partly it's a little bit just laziness, right? I spend a lot of time on Twitter, and I can't afford to, I feel like a bit of a burden, like in terms of maintaining a lot of, curating a lot of social media presences, right? And I like Twitter more, and I just didn't feel that engaged with Facebook. But also, I mean, Facebook has always been the most privacy invasive of the major sort of internet platforms, and takes the most liberties with user data and is kind of the pushiest, right? I don't like the platforms where they're constantly trying to, you know, pull me back in with a lot of notifications or kind of like scare me into coming back. And I feel like Facebook is kind of bullying in that regard. Like I used to get, I don't remember, a couple of years ago, I used to get a lot of notifications from Facebook that were essentially saying, so-and-so tagged you in a photo, like come and review it and see if you want it to be public. And I was kind of like, well, it's public, and you're kind of like, terrorizing me, right? Like you're like, come and check and make sure it's okay, and we're opting to public, and you can make it private if you return to the site constantly to mark things as private. And I just found it to be kind of an unpleasant experience. I just didn't enjoy it. And I also, at the same time, I was reading about how Facebook was a lot of nonprofit groups were finding that their posts weren't turning up on Facebook because they weren't paying for like sponsored status or whatever. And so it seemed to me like it was becoming less of a neutral platform where I saw what I signed up to see and I saw it in chronological order. It was becoming more commercialized. And I'm sort of impatient with commercialization. I just don't like it. And so I just wasn't enjoying myself very much, so I stopped going there. Yeah, sorry.
Micro-targeted ads for African Americans, and I wonder if you could address that with each other, like, or, I don't know, racially divisive kinds of things that were promoted on social media, because from what I read, and I think it was media, there was at least one rally that was supposed to take place, and someone who was representing an organization for civil rights showed up thinking it was a legitimate organization. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, and I don't know a lot about that. So like if somebody here knows more, do you know? Oh, repeat the question. I'm sorry. Yeah, and so the question, yeah, and so the question was around the sort of fake rallies, right? And I do not know a lot about this, and so if somebody else knows more than I do, like please bring it into the room. But what I remember is that, yeah, some of the Internet Research Agency work was actually making up rallies, right? And I think they got in touch, like actual people got in touch, like for example, by email with like Black Lives Matter's organizers and offered to, you know, help put the rally together, or like, we're gonna have a rally, can you help us, you know, get the message out and so forth. And there were a number of folks, I think there were some late Occupy people, I think, as well. And so there was this kind of strange outreach. And the goal of it actually was hard for me to decipher. I mean, you could try to interpret it, but I'm not sure what it was. But certainly what they were doing was they were offering various kinds of support, and it might have been with the goal of getting a bunch of email addresses of folks on the left, or it might have been to infiltrate, like who knows, right? And I think that what the Russian people who have dealt with the Internet Research Agency in the past inside Russia, what they say is that the real goal really is just to be confusing, right? And just to spread a kind of fog of noise and confusion so that people are looking over their shoulders and sort of second guessing themselves. And about 2 years ago, I happened to go, I was in Berlin and I went to the Stasi Museum. And it was really interesting to me to see the secret police, right? It was really interesting because they in the museum, they articulated a whole lot of the tactics that the Stasi used to use to keep the East German society unsure and destabilized. And they were very similar in an old school kind of way, right? But they used lots of techniques, like they would try to make people feel like they were unlucky or unsuccessful, and they did it by intervening to get them evicted and to plant rumors that they were having an affair so their wife would leave them and things like that. And it was incredible the amount of work that people put in to destabilize like leaders, right? And sort of decapitate their four movements. And so it wouldn't be surprising, right, if it was similar things like that happening during Russia. And part of what's challenging about all this too is that you don't want to sound or feel like a conspiracy theorist, right? And that's part of the inoculatory effect, is if everybody sounds like they're wearing a tinfoil hat, then nobody is trustworthy. That also helps, right, with the goals. So, yeah. Yep.
How do you go about advocating for changes in regulation? Regulation to protect user privacy. So often that language is immediately sort of co-opted by forces advocating to ban and to encryption.
Yep.
Ban it all in the name of user security. And they're using the same words and the same language.
I know.
And to the everyday user, it sounds like, well, yeah, absolutely, we should ban these things.
I know.
It's exactly the opposite effect of what we intended.
I know, right? No, I know. And I used to bristle all the time in the early days of the internet when there was a lot of talk about protecting children, right? Because I always feel like when you say protecting children, I worry, like, what is your actual agenda, right? Because it's so sort of motherhood and apple pie, it's like inarguable, right? And a lot of damage has been done in the name of protecting people against child pornography, for example, right? Because no one can ever argue that. It's like the third rail, right? And I don't know, but I mean, I am somewhat heartened by the fact that I think some of the senators are actually significantly smarter about the internet than they used to be. And like Al Franken is actually a good example, right? And I was reading something the other day where folks were criticizing Al Franken and trying to portray him as incredibly stupid about the internet. And I had felt the exact opposite after watching the Senate hearings. I thought he was doing an excellent job and really understood the issues. And so one thing that I try to remind myself is that it's very much in some people's interests, right, to portray politicians as out of touch and completely clueless. And so I don't know what you do with that, right, because the likelihood of helpful regulation in the United States right now, like it's got to be -500, right? Like there's just like, I can't imagine, right? And whatever steps come out of this Russia investigation that affect the internet are unlikely to be positive ones. My hope is, honestly, my hope is that we can get past the sort of initial kind of like libertarian, like very, black and white sort of focus, and maybe folks can work with the smarter folks in the Senate, like people like Franken, right? Because I think there is something to work with now that there wasn't maybe 10 years ago. Yeah.
Do you use a Tor browser on your phone or any sort of encrypted messaging apps?
I use Signal on my phone. I have used not the Tor browser, but I think it's Orbit.
Yeah.
I think, yeah. But I use Signal now. Do you use Signal?
No, I've always used Orbit.
Yeah, Signal is really, really terrific. It's just messaging, but there's a phone version and there's also a desktop version. The guy who makes it, Moxie Marlinspike in San Francisco, is really into making like very user-friendly, very beautiful products. And one of the challenges with the censorship circumvention type stuff is that it is not very user-friendly, right? Because it doesn't have millions of dollars to spend on product development and design. And that has a really disincentivizing effect on users because it makes it so that you have to really badly want the privacy protective aspects of it and be willing to give up a lot to get them. But Signal is beautiful and easy to use, and it's a pleasure to use, and it has all the same, it's actually the crypto that is used now in WhatsApp as well. WhatsApp has borrowed their crypto for its service. And it has a lot of the functionality of, for example, WhatsApp, so it's what I use. Yeah. Hi.
What's your take on websites like The Onion that are created for entertainment or for satire? Do they have a place in this sort of modern media network, or are you afraid that they'll sort of aid in the disinformation and misinformation trends that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, like personally, I love The Onion so much, right? And I find it so comforting all the time, right? And I feel like it is sufficiently well known enough that like I think we know that everybody knows what it is, right? But I do worry a lot about the other ones. There's a whole swath of them, and when all this stuff started turning up in my feed, like I was just like profoundly perplexed, right? And it took me a while to kind of like sort it out and figure out what everything was. And there are a whole bunch of sites turning up in my feed now that are satirical, but they're not The Onion. Like they're not legitimately funny, in my opinion, right? They're not really satire. I think they're using a satirical disclaimer for legal protections, right? So that they can always say, you know, we weren't malevolent, like it's right there. If people didn't get the joke, we can't stop them. And I think that's super dangerous. But again, like none of this stuff, like, you know, like I remember 10 years ago when we were like, everyone will have a printing press. And we're like, it's going to be so amazing, right? And not everybody, right? Like there were J-school teachers who were like, you know? And I remember I'm like, no, I'm in favor of the future, you know? And then the future comes and you're kind of like, oh my God, right? Like what a world without gatekeepers in some ways is really great, and in some ways it's like a nightmare, right? So yeah, I mean, certainly like adding to the confusion, right? And like, what do we even do? Like in a world where the definition of news is so much broader than it ever was and includes all these things that aren't conventionally what we have understood to be news, right? One thing that might happen is that Facebook might take news out of the Facebook feed, right? Like they're experimenting right now in 6 countries. Cambodia is one of them. I forget what the other ones are, with 2 separate news feeds. And so one would be news and one would be everything else. They're testing it. What happens where they're testing it is that traffic to news immediately goes to almost zero, right? Like nobody goes there anymore, which is absolutely terrifying for the news organizations, for example, in Cambodia, who right now are absolutely terrified. Like their revenue has dropped enormously, even from what it was, right? But I wouldn't be surprised if it's a thing that happens, because this is no fun for Facebook, right? They are getting forced to sort of testify at committees and so forth. They're taking a lot of heat. It's hurting their brand. People are more suspicious of Facebook than they used to be. And yet news only makes up something like 2% or 5% of the total Facebook feed. And so they're not getting much out of having it. It's turning into a bit of a lightning rod from a public relations perspective. And so it may be that ultimately they decide to bias themselves more towards, you know, the cat pictures and the baby pictures and the family stuff, right? And if that left them only with entertainment, like only with The Onion and the memes and the jokes and stuff like that, that maybe arguably in some ways that might be better. Of course I say that and I think, who decides what's news, right? So even that is hard and complicated. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
But how realistic do you think that is really? And are there conversations that talk about how do we really start paying for these and that's enough that?
Yep. Yeah, yeah, and it's even worse, you're right. Like, I mean, we never paid the full cost, and more recently, we've paid practically none of the costs, right? Yeah, and so the question is, are we gonna pay for news? And if we are gonna pay for news, how will that happen? I think it's possible that people are gonna do the same thought process that I did, right? And that we're all gonna be kind of like, okay, like reluctantly or not. Google, it did though, right? Absolutely, yeah. Like iTunes is flourishing, right? Like there are a number of, it's turned into a subscription business, right? Like entertainment tends towards subscription, like Netflix and stuff like that. And news, subscription only works for news if it's non-commodity news, right? So it only works if it's very elite or business, your company is paying for it. But Google is working on a new product, you know Google AMP? It's kind of the alternative to, so you can put your news on Facebook, which everybody does, right? And it gets you faster delivery and an ad revenue share and a bunch of stuff, right? That started happening, what, 3, 5 years ago? I'm not sure. It was quite a while ago. Everybody was afraid to do it at the time. They did it anyway because they didn't see any choice. More and more people were getting their news from social sharing. They felt like they had to be there, right? A couple of years ago, Google made a similar kind of product, only theirs is open source, and it's called AMP, A-M-P. And my understanding is that Google is now starting to work on a payment module that would go along with AMP so that if the publisher wanted to charge, they could figure out with Google a way to do that. I have no idea what that would look like, but there are a couple things about it that are sort of heartening, right? One is, if Google does it, it will be user-friendly and a breeze, right? Which has not been the case really with any user pay. Like, remember all those tip jars and like all that kind of stuff and Kajingle, and like there were a lot of ways that people tried to make micropayments work. They were all clumsy, none of them took off. If Google does it though, it will be successful, like it will be elegant and beautiful and everywhere, and so people might actually use it, right? If that enables people, like let's say you're on your phone and you pay on your phone and it turns up on your phone bill, it's all kind of invisible to you, you know, or it's tied to your bank account or whatever. If it's easy, right, that actually has been a huge impediment. When I was at the Wikimedia Foundation, Wikimedia operates on a user pay model, right? So it's donations voluntarily from ordinary people. And we found that the easier it was for people to pay, this is unsurprising, but we got way more money, right? Like ease of use was a huge driver. And I have felt the same way. Like I'll donate to NPR or something. For 1,000 years, I didn't donate to NPR until they implemented PayPal. And I was like, okay, finally, right? I'm not typing in my credit card number. But when they went to PayPal, I was like, fine, you know? So people's motivation to donate or to pay is super weak. And so if there can be a system that is really, really easy, that might actually go some distance towards it. The other model, though, that is sort of working right now, inside the news industry, the folks I talk with are excited about the future of nonprofit news organizations. I am kind of dubious about that personally. I think it's hard to scale up and to like maintain anything that's really large with a nonprofit model. But we are seeing increasingly, for good or for ill, a model where extremely wealthy retired billionaires, right, pay the cost of news production. That's how ProPublica got started. That's how The Intercept pays their bills, is eBay Piero Mijar's money, right? There's another example that I'm blanking on right now, but there's another one. Yeah, right? Yes. There's another more classic example, but yes, right? And that was the case, I forget, early in journalistic history, I think that was true, right? It was wealthy, philanthropically inclined, civic-minded, right? I feel like that might get people through the next little bit until user pay sorts itself out. But I feel like ultimately, you know, if you want the press to work for you, you have to pay for the press, right? Because otherwise it's not working for you, it's working for somebody else.
One last question.
Okay. No pressure on the person asking the last question.
Any questions?
Thank you.
You mentioned earlier about the whole Pizzagate scandal, and then you showed that image, I guess it was a meme, you know, Jesus, Satan, and all that.
Uh-huh.
It all seems, you know, pretty understandable as kind of a hokey
Yeah, yeah. And it's super hard, right? Like, and I am also not an educator, blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm just not, right? But I will tell you, the one success story that I know about in terms of media literacy, and this is going to sound a little bit self-serving me saying this, but using Wikipedia as a model for discussing media literacy is actually very useful. And the reason it's useful is because Wikipedia is like extremely humble because it can be wrong, right? Because anybody can edit it. And so Wikipedia kind of is not resistant to scrutiny. It kind of welcomes it and it wants people to sort of test their assumptions and check the, you know, check the footnotes and make sure they go to the place they say they do and stuff like that. So, and it has kind of a treasure hunt component to it because it may be false, but it may not be false, right? So it's actually a kind of good training ground, right? And people can learn, like, from it, you learn like what the sort of markers of credibility are, because the markers haven't changed, right? If you see something on the internet that is full of like spelling mistakes, right, or like terrible grammatical errors or something, that suggests to you that, you know, not a lot of care has been taken with that product, right? And so my experience, and this is not with older people, this is with younger people, right? But my experience is that if you talk kids through, or rather, you get them to talk you through their experience of a Wikipedia article and how you would be able to tell if it was true or not true, that actually can be, I think, really helpful. I think part of the problem with media literacy, other people in the room know better than I and more than I do about this stuff, but I think part of the problem with media literacy is it is often predicated on the assumption that the adult knows everything and the child knows nothing. And I think right now we're living in this weird moment where everybody knows a piece of the thing, right? Like the child might have much more facility with the internet or have in some ways a more skeptical orientation than the older person, right? So I think that a model where you're working together to figure out the answer is actually a lot more likely to be productive than a model where you're telling a child, like, don't do this online, but not an expert.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Bob.